what has become more popularized within the left has been this merging of what you might call a Marxist interpretation of the problems in the world combined with Marxist solutions. We can call that, the democratization, radical egalitarianism, whatever, combined with more of a postmodernist and deconstructionist philosophy. And the reason why I think that is so critical and necessary to understand is because if I got a communist over here and I got a free market Austrian school economist on this side, and they both agree that the laws of logic apply, they can actually look at observable reality and hopefully come to some agreement about what works and what doesn't work, et cetera. If you apply a postmodernist approach, where now all of a sudden there's no such thing as objective truth, there's just your perspective, my perspective, and then you add on top of that critical theory, which says that not only is there not objective truth, but the laws of logic are on some level a tool of the ruling or oppressor class to keep the oppressed down to the benefit of their own, to the benefit of themselves or their own systems. You've now created a world where your feet are planted, firmly in midair, because now there is what mechanism are we supposed to use to adjudicate differences with respect to the data that we see? If you've now said that, hey, you have your perspective, I have my perspective, you have your data, I have my data, and we're gonna come together, we're gonna look at all this utilizing these tools. And now you've just said I don't want the tools anymore. Like, how do we peacefully adjudicate anything then? I mean,
Oh yeah. It's actually kind of the same problem with I'm gonna drop a bomb. This is something I've been planning on making a video of for quite a while, but I just didn't get to it. The
yeah.
issue with radical postmodernism is that it's effectively just presuppositional apologetics for secular people. If you know what presuppositional
I
apologetics
do.
is,
I do.
oh, good.
Yeah.
So you
Yeah.
that's why you laugh because you know
Yeah.
what I'm talking about. It's effectively just justifying circular logic in your favor. It's saying that logic it's an attempt to logically destroy the idea of logic. But the problem is that by doing that, you've admitted that you're wrong because you can't use logic to defeat logic because you're accepting that logic is valid in order to do
Yeah.
that. And with presuppositional apologetics, I have nothing against the religious right. I think they have
Yeah.
a lot of good ideas, but I don't like it when people only give religious arguments in favor of ideas. And that's actually why I think there's a need for a more intellectual right wing. That's one of the reasons why a lot of people laugh at the conservative concepts is because the right kind of got hijacked by a lot of arguments that effectively, instead of stating we should do X because of time preferences and these reasons and this actual data of why we should do X, and it kind of got replaced by we should do X because God says so.
Mhm.
And what people don't understand is that that's actually a bad argument, even if it's true. Even if God actually does exist and God is telling you that you should do X, the problem is it's just not very convincing. It's not actually a good argument. It's really just an appeal to authority. It doesn't actually explain why it is true. And in
Well, it's
presuppositional apologetics, they're just justifying circular reasoning to use that kind of reasoning. And
well,
that's all that
I'm gonna
postmodernism does.
I'm gonna defend Cornelius Van Til and Greg Bonson here a little bit on the presuppositional side, because I will say that the one difference between a theistic presuppositional argument versus what in many cases is a purely atheistic presuppositional model, is I understand that they're saying that every single worldview has to have a starting point. And the question is that starting point capable of justifying the tools that you're going to use to reason? And so, like
I'm glad you're saying this.
what's that?
I'm
Yeah,
really glad you're saying this because you're actually getting on my next point, is that
yeah,
not only is radical postmodernism effectively just presuppositional apologetics for secular people, it's
mhm,
actually worse because
mhm,
presuppositional apologetics at least tries to foot itself in saying, okay, we can't use reason, but our God can. We get our source of reason from God. But in the case of postmodern and radical postmodernism, they get their source of reasoning from um
yeah,
nowhere.
yeah, yeah,
So the
yeah,
religious argument of presuppositional apologetics at least has some kind of basis up high in the sky, whereas
mhm,
radical postmodernism has no basis whatsoever. It completely is self-defeating. They're
yeah,
admitting that they're wrong, but they're admitting that they're wrong in a way that's thousands and thousands of pages of word salad,
yeah,
and you only realize why they're wrong when you take the whole thing in one gulp and you realize, wait a minute,
Yeah.
this is
Well,
just one
it's
big massive contradiction.
no, yeah, it's interesting. Because yeah, I've listened to a lot of Greg Bahnsen, who's he would call himself a covenantal apologist, but he passed away a while back. But yeah, his statement would be, he's like, no, I want to use logic, I want to use reason. His argument would be that a proper understanding of, let's say, Christianity, because that's what he was, and what I am for that matter. He would say, well, that of course the starting point for everything is God, and so nothing can exist outside of God, and so therefore God, now logic, reason, and everything else.
Exactly.
And I get what he's saying there from an epistemological standpoint, right? It does provide a certain degree. It provides a justification for all those things. But yeah, to your point about postmodernism, is I
It has
find it
nothing.
inter. Yeah,
There's
there's
nothing
nothing.
there.
There's no starting point for this. It's just because we say so ultimately, and I think, again, when because I've asked people this, it's amazing. I will talk to students and I will say, how many people believe that there's no such thing as like objective truth? There's your truth, there's my truth. There's no such thing as objective truth. And it's amazing how many people will raise their hands, and then I'll ask them a question. So is that true? and 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 you'll get these confused looks. And I was like, look, a professor once worded it best. He says, when anybody tells you there's no such thing as objective truth, they're telling you not to believe them. So don't.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah. But that's kind of what I wanted to ask you, is like, do you think, um, again, without getting into, because I think there's two dynamics of the modern left that are different from what we would have called like the Soviet left, right? Or even the traditional Marxist left. One is this the introduction of critical theory, and we can go to the Frankfurt School and Marcuse and all that, and then the other is this idea of so it's the oppressor oppressed dynamic, and the idea that there's no such thing as objective truth. And I would say the other component that I find is interesting, and the thing that ultimately makes it impossible for them to win is the complete, like the wanton attack on masculinity.
Oh yeah,
Um,
it guarantees that they'll eventually destroy their own society. I mean, on that,
yeah,
we kind of now we kind of just end up switching the conversation more to wokeness in general because that's
yeah,
where it comes
yeah,
from. And if we're gonna talk about that, I think it's important for me to first say what the definition is because
sure.
leftists are and Marxists are always whining about, oh, all these deranged right wingers are talking about wokeness and they never defined it. So before I
Mhm.
even go into this, I'm going to define it. And I consider wokeness to be an aggressive push for diversity, equity, inclusion. It is usually based on this belief that outcomes which lack these things are indicative of discrimination and or unfair social treatment.
Yeah,
And so that's my definition. And in addition to that definition, I think it's also important to point out that the logical conclusion of this is envy and hatred directed at groups of people who are successful. Or in the case that
yeah,
you are within a collective group, and I say that in quotations because I'm not a collectivist, but in cases that you are a member of that collective group that has greater levels of success and outcome, feelings of guilt and shame if you
mhm,
happen to be in that population group. That's kind of where you get a lot of these cringe far lefty takes on white privilege, where you see sort of a white liberal who hates his own skin and,
yeah,
and
yeah,
doesn't want to admit it. It all stems from this extremely toxic belief that if you have something more than someone else, then you must have done something wrong to get it.
yeah,
Which is interesting because when you understand that, you begin to realize that wokeness is, in fact, just a form of the fixed pie fallacy.
yes,
It is. It's
yeah,
entirely a fixed pie fallacy. And it's also not true. It's all based on the equity fallacy, the idea that unequal outcomes equal discrimination. And
mhm,
we know that that's not true. You can just
yeah,
look at basic history and use the basic logic to determine that that's not true. For instance, go back 3,000 years ago and look at various human societies. Did ancient Greek and Roman societies discriminate against various Indo societies on the other side of the world that they didn't even know
mhm,
existed, even though they weren't having equal outcomes at the time? No. So
yeah,
obviously things like culture and population and a whole and where of course your society is, because that's very important because a society in the mountains is not going to have the same outcome as a society by the beach, which is not going to have the same outcome as a society that takes place in the desert.
mhm,
Earth has multiple different biomes. So we also have to take that into account and consideration as well. There's a lot of other reasons for the equity fallacy that are not discrimination. And so it's important to understand that that's where wokeness is. It's also important to understand that currently wokeness is law. The disparate impact standard within how civil rights are actually done
Mhm.
allows people to say that if there's an unequal outcome, then that's evidence of discrimination, which can then be taken to court. That's another
Yeah.
very important aspect because leftists, they like to pretend that the reason they have won recently in academia and media and in the culture in the last 60 years or so has been because their ideas are correct and thus the science is on their side. But
Yeah.
in reality, that's a lie. The reason they have been winning in those fields is because the law made it illegal for them to lose.
Mhm.
That it's currently illegal for them to lose. They aren't correct. They've just had the state on their side since the equity fallacy has effectively been enshrined into law, which allows far leftists and Marxists within our intellectual institutions to easily push out anyone who doesn't agree with these stances based on the idea that inequality of outcome is primarily caused by discrimination.
Mhm.
Any professor in, say, Yale or Harvard who doesn't agree with that can then be pushed out. They can then be falsely accused of being a bigot or a racist until eventually these institutions are populated by a bunch of pseudo intellectual midwits who have absolutely no idea what the heck they're doing.